talk about organizing people, but ultimately if you accept that as a systemic problem, you are into what kind of a system do you want if you don't like the one you're facing and you don't like the old models. So part of this book, the first part of the book, is very attempts to address some of these theoretical problems and some of the design questions in some larger sense. So for instance, Ted and I and another colleague tried to take that same principle to the national level. So what would it look like nationally? Supposing we were to do mass transit, high-speed rail, and a whole system around the country that would actually maximize those. That would be all public money and commuter money. We don't do any of that in the United States. We have one tiny little company in Oregon that builds a little bit of streetcars. But the only companies that build that kind of systems are in Canada and in France and in Japan and now in China and in Germany to a certain degree. We don't have any industry there. So it's an entirely new industry if we were to do it. So who should own that industry? It's all going to be public money and commuter money. Who should own it? Well, we've had one model. We just nationalized General Motors and Chrysler. And indeed, in both those cases, we had a labor VIBA structure related to the health system as part owners. We just did that. Now that it's profitable with all the public money in it, we're giving it back to the corporations. When the next time comes around, that model of a public market aimed at stabilizing communities with some form of worker ownership and control that's very practical, that model can be, that's simply an illustration and expansion of what I'm talking about in terms of the Cleveland model. So you can begin to sketch ways in which larger industry could be developed in a serious model beyond the local level if you begin to think about these principles. But by the way, if you look at what happened in the 30s and in the 20s and in the women's movement, most of what became national program, start with the vote for women, was a state-by-state, city-by-city effort that built up principles which, when the moment was right, became translated nationally. So partly what we're interested in and what this book is about, and what I would suggest to you, that it is possible today in the United States of America, not only possible but necessary, feasible, starting where the pain is very great and where people know that none of the old answers work. Nobody believes a training program will solve the problem anymore. Nobody believes a poverty program will. You try to bring the corporations in with a big bribe and they leave as soon as the bribe runs out. Everybody knows that. That's not something that you can only read about in the economics class. Starting where the pain, real alternatives are in demand and can be talked about, and they involve democratization of capital inevitably, because that's where the control and the power is. So I'm suggesting to you something very, very radical, that it is practical to begin to develop transformation of who owns the means of production. Practical and politically viable. And if you think, now I'm going to bring it back to the context, and if you think or accept the proposition that we are in a highly unusual framework of history, a system that doesn't collapse, but doesn't reform, but stagnates and is in pain as an ongoing phenomenon, that context is precisely the context which is going to force more and more people to ask questions about what can we do here that will actually solve a problem. That's where the answer can be offered, if you have an answer, if you know where you want to go. So our sense of what's been happening, we've been tracking it, and I'll give you, you mentioned this work I did with the steelworkers in Youngstown. Why Cleveland? Cleveland. Now, it is a city of great pain, gone from 800,000 to about 350,000 in the last 30 years. Parentheses, if you don't stabilize communities, you haven't got a shot at all dealing with climate change. You can't do sustainable community development when the bottom is pulled out every time the corporations move. So economic planning sufficient to bring those mass transit, in that case, in to stabilize that community is the precondition of any kind of ecologically sustainable climate change program. You can't do that as long as they keep throwing away cities and moving on and throwing away cities. That's what they live by, you know, that's what they do. They come in, the houses, the schools, the roads, the hospitals are in the community, they pull out, all that stuff's in decay, all that carbon content is in decay, and then they go build it someplace else. Throwing away cities David Harvey has studied this from another point of view, but uneven development is the way it's often talked about. But what it is throwing away capital and throwing away carbon. Unless you can stabilize, and the mass transit example gives you one way to think about that, you can't deal with climate change. And unless you can stabilize the larger context, you can't deal with growth and you can't deal with climate change. We can spend more time on that. But what I'm suggesting much more importantly in terms of this period of our history, if you're willing to throw a couple decades of your life on the table, is a period that by necessity and by great pain is open to new answers. And the only real answers, in my judgment, involve changing who owns that capital in very American, down-home, explainable terms. Paul Sawyer's right. If you can't explain it to a peasant, that's your problem, not his. The rhetoric goes down and the realities and the meaning and the content goes up with practicality. So I am suggesting a very radical proposition to you. I said I thought it was the most important period of American history, bar none, because the systemic alternatives are ending, in my judgment, and because it is a very unusual context, one that doesn't collapse but decays, that generates a breakdown in ideology, an openness to new alternatives, and the possibility for the first time in American history for serious organizing for people who have ideas and commitment and content. So the real question is really, it's not a political question. It's an existential question. What are we willing to do? When I say we, I mean the person in your seat and standing here. It's existential. What are we willing to commit to in terms of our own understanding, the development of the depth of our knowledge, the development of a serious response at all of these levels? My own sense, and I'll kind of bring it down to a different ending here, my own sense is that as we are going forward, this period is best understood not as achieving systemic change, but we have a chance to establish the necessary foundations in people, in ideas, in structure, in political understanding, and in theory, and in on-the-ground practice of what a decentralized, democratized ownership system might look like. We have the possibility of establishing the foundations upon which a real transformation might actually be possible. Now that's the scariest part, because most people don't really want to believe that. Most people don't want to believe in hope. Pessimism is much safer because you don't have to do anything. If there might be a possibility that what we actually do makes sense and could be instrumental in systemic change, if that is actually not rhetorical, but real, it is a very heavy charge, because then you've got to step up to the plate and start asking much tougher questions, and start doing much tougher things, and start making much longer commitments, and start actually acting as if the system can be changed rather than being protested. I'm a realist, I'm a historian and a political economist. My own sense is that it is well within the possibilities of these decades that this generation can in fact lay down the foundations for a possible transformation in all those realms. It is a time when answers are being demanded that can't be given in any other way. I think it is, that's my judgment, so you all have to make your own judgments about that. But once one begins to sense that possibility, no more, it leads towards a lot of specific activity. It leads to doing some concrete activist work, without which nothing. And at many levels, liberal, conservative, libertarian, liberal, radical, libertarian, even some of the old conservatives, like the ones I mentioned, means getting your hands in and figuring out what to do in a specific community. It means doing what the old women's movement did in the 60s, study groups. Actually, Chairman Mao said, power comes out of the barrel of a gun, and the women's movement said, no. Power comes when 6 women get together over coffee, start reading, and start supporting each other, and then start organizing. The women were right about that in our context. that is learning and thinking and doing and then acting together with support and learning something about what can be done, that becomes another form of activity if linked to actually doing something active. But the hardest part I find is that most people really don't want to believe in possibility. So I'm going to lay that on you as, again, as a heavy wrap, that it may be that we together have this chance for the first time in the history of the United States to actually establish the basis of something that could be transformative. And why I'm really pleased to be here in the Howard Zinn lecture, I gather this is, and to be with you guys, is that you guys have been leading it, and particularly the occupation movement, and all the people that have supported it, have opened the space much, much wider and unexpectedly. Nobody thought that was out there. Nobody thought people would respond to this 1%, 99%. It's been out there all the time. The facts have been there. If you read the New York Times or the Boston Globe, nobody cares about what's going on until someone found a way to ignite it. And then you found out everybody cared. That's why it's very fragile in terms of the support system, and why it's also very possible, I think, for all of us to begin to actually move in a new direction if we're serious. So thank you very much.
You didn't mention B corporations.
Well, yes, there are many. That's another experiment. The B corporations, they're corporations that. Here's basically how they run is this. In several states, I think, has Massachusetts done it?
No.
No, Maryland has done it. Several states have done it. If you're a corporate director or a corporate small business or a large business, you are required by law to fulfill your responsibility as a corporate director, meaning you can't spend money on things that are not good for the shareholders, and they can sue you. That's what private capitalist corporation is. And this is another sign of this kind of odd breakdown in the ideology. Some progressive businessmen have found a way, invented something called the B Corp, where they essentially remove that legal requirement so they can do things for the community with some of their money. So they're sprouting up all over. It's the kind of soft end of this democratization part. It's another element of trying to experiment with it. And as I say, Maryland, where I am, has just passed a law last year to allow this. So I'm not particularly favorable to B Corp. I think they're not terribly significant, except in that they open the direction. And even here you see this hunger for a new answer. And the B Corp is the kind of softest end of it. The public ownership, 25%, I should have mentioned, 25% of electricity in the United States. Let me give you a couple other elements, just to tough this up. 25% of the electricity in the United States is generated by co-ops and municipally owned businesses, utilities. 25%. Socialized. Now, a third of the land surface is socialized. 27 states have ownership of some stock in venture capitalist forms. You know about the permanent ownership in Alaska, where the oil revenues are distributed publicly, part of the public. Alabama has, for maverick reasons, has ownership of worker-owned companies financed by the state government. If you poke down, there's all these experiments that can be generalized that are actually going on. B Corp is the soft end of that stuff. So that's yes, sir.
Yeah, the society that you paint is very attractive to me. But to be honest, I don't think that the question is existential. I think it's political. What is the corporations in the state going to be doing while we try to bring capital into some kind of social ownership? I mean, if history is any indication, they're going to be opposing that. And so what kind of politics is going to be necessary to defeat that?
Well, first let me say that until there is a politics that has this content, or something like this content, that I said in my view we're at the place of laying foundations for a transformation. That includes laying down understanding of what the politics will be beyond regulate the corporation and try to tax them, beyond a liberal program. So, but it must have a political understanding. But it has no meaning unless there's content. Unless it has a meaningful content. So that's what I'm emphasizing here, and the content comes from ideas but also practice. Well, we'll see about the corporations. I'm not at all as sure that, this has been a standard judgment that, oh, you can't do it because they'll smash you.
I didn't say that.
Well, that has been a standard judgment on the left.
Yeah.
That's a conventional judgment on the left. And there are variations on that. And the answer is, well, we'll see. That is to say, if you look carefully, for instance, at the healthcare industry, and you really look carefully at it, the major corporations are deeply split on healthcare. A lot of them don't want to support the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies at all because it loads them in international competition. There are divisions amongst the ruling class, if you want that language. And so by no means concentrated. Secondly, this country is, and this is another element of this that we take up in the book, this country is extremely large. You can drop Germany into Oklahoma. Yeah, I'm not kidding. When I lecture about it in the classroom, I say, you know, those dinky European countries, by which I mean France can be dropped into Arizona and New Mexico. And Germany, those polities can pull together a much tighter political. But many parts of the country, the corporations are not involved, or they've left it, or they're fighting over it, or there's divisions. It is by no means clear that there is a united corporate class. But certainly there will be resistance. Certainly they are trying, but we'll see. The question becomes, another way to put it is this, and again, this is how I think about it. Another way to put it, the real pain in the system is at the external parts of the internal empire. Let me say that again. The real pain in the system is Cleveland, which is the external parts of the internal corporate empire. But if you see the American continent as an empire that the corporations are to manage it, they can't manage some of the pain levels in all these parts. And that's where the organizing starts. You don't start at the head of the monster. You start where the pain is greatest. So we'll see. Certainly they will smash anything they can if we don't build alternative power. But what I'm suggesting is that the conditions for building alternative power with real content, not just protest and not just politics, is potentially within our grasp if we're serious about it.
Thanks. Try to make this make sense. So, you know, the idea of building worker co-ops and creating these new networks, obviously important to see how that's working. But you sort of alluded to the Mondragon issue where, you know, say even with the Cleveland model, you're building up kind of your somewhat insulated, you know, kind of situation. They're still ultimately operating on the market system. And all the same pressures that are applying to these companies, the same, you know, even if you have sort of a closed market that they've been able to set up with these nonprofits. So I guess my question is like, you know, there's some theorists who are talking about democratic planning models. I'm sure you're familiar with Paracon.
Right.
I was wondering if you're familiar with Inclusive Democracy Project from this guy named Fotopoulos in Britain or whatever. But there's sort of, these models are actually trying to be specific about how you're doing your planning around the goods and services that we're consuming.
Right.
And you sort of alluded to the issue of trying to build this out without that broader politics, but I didn't really hear kind of how you think about.
Yeah.
To me, that the replacement of the market is a fundamental question that we could build all around it, but until we address it directly, you know, we're still screwed.
Well, that's a good question. I think what I like about the Paracon model is that they've opened this discussion, and also the prior theoretical work that they did together was really quite important in laying down the question of what the market actually does to the economic models. Those of you who know what the earlier work that was done by Michael Albert and Robin Hanel, which led to the Paracon model. I don't think the Paracon model is workable. But they have focused the question. And the way in which the design that we're exploring in the Cleveland model or in the book attempts to get at it is it does have a planning model, but it has a large community democratizing component to it. Mike Albert and I did something at the Last Left Forum together. And I said to him, here's one way to think about it. They're trying to solve the planning problem by using these very complex citizen iteration processes, which many people think are not workable. Another way to get at it, because they're worried about the corrosion that the market has on individuals and on institutions, and that's a fair question. That's a really important question. Another way to get at it is the following, for those of you who are non-economists as well. You know, this is the richest country in the history of the world. If you broke up the GDP, even now, into equal shares for families of 4, it's about 190,000 right now at a 42-hour week. Or 100,000, roughly speaking, at a 20-hour week. And by the end of the century, easily, you know, a 10-hour week and $100,000 in real terms, not inflated. We could go through the numbers. We've done all the projections, and they're very simple projections, even allowing for the energy problems. It is a very rich country. They've got us all focused on problems, but the fact is this ought to be the wonderful moment of history because the productive forces are so great. What that gives you, and why I bring it up in this context with your question, is that if you translate the productive capacity into time, then you can have democracy in any system to manage the planning system. So the way out of the problem that Mike Albert and Robin Hanel focused, in my view, is time for citizen participation as a way to solve that problem, and using both the market and planning, but under citizen management. And time gives you that possibility. That's the way out, I think. And again, it allows for citizenship and development of a planned, semi-planned system.
Can I just ask a short, well, sorry, I don't mean to take the time, but how do you think about pricing in that situation?
Well, pricing is all in all these cases. In all capitalist and corporate, capitalist and socialist systems are always a mix of market and government subsidy or government regulation or government involvement. So the pricing mechanisms are always complex. They're partly real economic, but when you look at what the subsidies that in the production process are, they're partly non-economic, they're partly political choices. So I think it's a mixed question always, but you always get back to what does a citizen really want in terms of output of the whole system. And that requires citizens, and that requires time and stability. Well, let me say this quickly. Here, I'm going to short circuit the number. You must have planning of some kind. If it's to be democratic planning, you must have citizens. And if you have to have citizens, you have to have time, and you have to have community. You can't do it without time, citizens, and community. So the model has to be resolved around all of those. And again, the book takes up exactly that question as an answer. We don't hit there, but it's an answer to the problem that Mike and Robin have been struggling with in Paracon. Because they've got the right question, I think. I don't agree with their answer, but they focused it for us. Yes?
Well, for me, this evening is historic because it's the first time I have felt that the pernicious and terrible effects of McCarthyism in this country have been overcome. Because one of the effects of McCarthyism was that people could not have these conversations. They were considered taboo. They were considered too frightful to have. They were considered too mechanistic. There were all kinds of reasons why you couldn't even have these conversations. And this is the first time I have felt that 60-year curse that we've had from McCarthyism is finally being overcome. And I'm thankful for it.
I have to say two things about that. It's not from Wisconsin, where Joe McCarthy was. So I want to say something about pessimism and optimism. See, I'm older than some of the people in this room. I was brought up, I was in school in Racine, Wisconsin, my hometown, little industrial town in Wisconsin. And Joe McCarthy was everywhere when I was in school. They shot anything that moved politically. It was really oppressive. My school teachers were scared to say anything political. So if you had asked anybody then, is change possible? And they would laugh at you because they knew nothing could be done. And then the 60s exploded. So I don't take, it was a powerful unlearning. I don't take seriously people saying, because nothing can be done. Well, maybe. Or maybe not. We'll see. Anyways, thank you for raising Joe McCarthy. Barry.
The power of the liberal social democratic model is they had an institutional force. You mentioned the unions.
Yeah.
What's the institutional force? There's a whole history of analysis. Youre was involved in this stuff going back to the Cambridge Institute of the union movement. What led to it, the forces that made it real. What are the forces that are building, and what's the institution that'll be the base of what you're talking about?
There's a man after my own heart, because that's a critical question. Exactly the right question. Listen, I'm a friend of the labor movement. Whatever we can do to back the labor movement is very important, but it in fact is decaying. So those are the realities. What I have suggested to you, if you peel back the institutional side of this, what is being laid down in these experiments is a basis in institutions in the ownership of capital, which, if politicized, give you an institutional base to displace corporate power, co-op by co-op if you like, and to provide the institutional basis as a substitute or addition to the labor union. That's the heart of the question we're talking about in terms of the politics. And that's what comes out of these organizational possibilities. Democratizing ownership becomes one of the elements in the replacement of the institution? It's a right-on question.
Can I ask a follow-up? Which
Yeah.
is, given that they have to grow for a long time,
Yep.
within the context of our current market stalemates, and they have to adapt and live within and thrive and grow within that,
Right.
how do we go from building those institutions to making them transformative politically? How do we politicize them as opposed to help them just become the next co-op bank?
It's a good question, because Co-op Bank has been a failure, because it didn't have a politics. And it didn't fulfill its responsibility. That is, he has laid down the challenge of the politics of all of our lives. Transforming ownership, and with it bringing a politics of education and understanding and theory and development. Notice what the Tea Party's talking about. It's really interesting. They're talking about liberty and democracy. The government is destroying liberty. Now, what's that got to do with the pain they're feeling? People, what we're talking about is building the infrastructure with an idea system that you can explain has the way to build democracy and liberty and ecological sustainability and all the values. You can't get there without making that linkage. If you're doing it, you're just doing liberal politics with a little this and a little that doesn't have any ideological thrust. And so here's the argument, gang. The argument, the contention is, unless you can build a radically decentralized, community-based system, institution by institution, you cannot argue for democracy. And if you can't argue for democracy, you can't get there. But in other words, that you actually have to think through those linkages. And the contention is that this institutional way of going about it, and this is a crude map, but something in this direction offers you the possibility. The book begins with the collapse of liberty, democracy, and equality over 30 years and the trends. And that the question becomes, do we have an institutional and a political answer that actually addresses that, rather than a slogan? But and the institutional base is part of the power system as well, in the internal empire. Right? And those questions are right on. Those are the ones I really worry about, yeah. Sir. Hey, Chris.
So we ran an article in Dollars and Cents a couple of years ago after the beginning of the financial or the economic crisis about the Burlington, Vermont community land trust system and how Burlington was much better off than other parts of the country. Its housing market was much better off, and the prices didn't collapse as much, and they hadn't gone up as much. And I'm wondering if there have been good economic studies about Cleveland and how Cleveland fared in other words, like if people see that having this kind of system makes them less vulnerable to economic shocks, that might.
Yeah, there's two questions there. First, land trust. I want to say something about land trust and also the steelworkers thing, because it's about the politics of it too. So you all know, anybody know what land trust is? Who doesn't know land trust? It's essentially socializing the land in a nonprofit. Let's use the land. Socializing the land through a nonprofit or corporation or city. And one of the first, most important ones was in Burlington. There's a couple, one in Western Mass and one in Georgia in the 60s. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of decades. In those years, Burlington, Western Mass, and Georgia were the only ones in the country, and they were regarded as ridiculously weird. Land trusts are all over the country now. In Washington, D.C., the city government invests in mass transit. The land values go up, and instead of giving it to the corporations, they socialize it. They call it a land trust. In America, in many cities, because the tax base is declining, and it makes sense. There are openings of this kind, and there's a spread all over. In Irvine, California, they're doing 10,000 units of housing on land trust. Impossible 3 decades ago. Crazy socialism. But you can explain it, and it has advantage. Okay, so that's number one. And there are the examples on Community-Wealth will give you lots of examples of that. And in Cleveland, the solar-based greenhouse is on a large land trust, and we're going to put in a land trust for housing as well. Now, Cleveland, those of you who know about urban development, Cleveland looks like a bombed-out area. It looks like Detroit. This is $18,000 a year and destroyed houses. There's no land values at all. The argument that you put in a land trust now because you're actually planning for success, to prevent it from gentrifying, seemed totally weird 4 years ago. Now the cultural sense This is a big deal. The cultural sense is, we shall overcome, goddammit. We're putting in a land trust because we're going to build this stuff. There is a change in consciousness. Not in the abstract, but in ordinary people working on this stuff. That's part of the game. That's part of what happens when you actually begin to roll. And it's very hard work. I mean, I mentioned Ted Howard and Steve Dubb of our staff did it. Here's how you do it. 140 interviews with procurement officers in hospitals and universities saying, where do you buy your stuff and why don't you buy it here? Where do you buy your stuff and why don't you buy it here? Well, we buy stuff and why don't you buy it here? 140 detailed interviews as a starting point. So don't mess with this unless you want to play with it. And that's the kind of stuff that's going on. I want to say something about George, about the land trust development. I should throw some decades on the table. It's much more pain now, so things move a lot faster. But the guys who did that stuff, Bob Swan in Western Massachusetts, were starting something that did not look like it was going anywhere. And they were on to and now there are more and more people. You know, I said, why Ohio? I worked in Ohio in 1977 when the Youngstown Sheet and Tube was closed down. 1977, some of you, there are a couple of gray hairs, you may remember that 5,000 people were thrown out of work on one day in September. In 1977, that was a gigantic front page New York Times news story on every news, because it hadn't happened. 5,000 people, now it happens every day now. 5,000 people lost their jobs in steelworks. And a coalition of steelworkers and religious leaders in the city pulled together a plan, which I was the architect of the plan with them, of a workers' community-owned steel mill. And they got backing from all the politicians in the state. They forced the Carter administration at that time into backing with $200 million in loan guarantees. And they understood, here's the edge. They understood that even if they failed, they would educate people as to the new vision. Well, the Carter administration, after the election in 1978, because of the international steelworkers and the corporations, pulled the rug out from under it. And in Ohio today, the idea of worker-owned companies is all over the place as ordinary. And that's the basis of why it's possible in places like Cleveland. Now, Cleveland has done that for Pittsburgh and Oakland and Washington, D.C. and Atlanta and several other cities that say, hey, why don't we do it here? We can't solve our problem another way. There's a huge interest in this stuff that is the content is what I've said. But it's very American if you understand it in practical terms. Much faster now. But the developmental process of the people in Ohio, people like John Logue, the late John Logue, who set up a little institute to try to help worker ownership, and then was involved both and he was inspired by Youngstown and then was involved with us in the Cleveland effort. That process over time, transforming people